So thank you again for coming out to the opening session of our series entitled, Is History Repeating Itself? This is a webinar series exploring the Black experience and redevelopment in Canada. We invite anyone who has questions or comments throughout the presentation to put it in the Q&A box, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. We will have a question and answer session after our two guest presentations, and we'll answer any questions that you have at that moment. So now it is really important that we acknowledge and reflect on the history and the history of the land that we are on. So I would love to introduce one of our honored guests tonight, Denise Bishop-Earle. Denise is a parent of 4 lovely children who are now adults. She has worked and lived in Lawrence Heights for over 37 years. Denise's talents as an artist, community activist, and knowledge keeper have helped her in the facilitation of healing circles since 2012, with a focus on the impact of community violence. She is currently researching her family history and has been working on a participatory learning experience that documents the migration of people of African origin and descent to Canada throughout its history. So Denise, I kindly ask you to take us through the land acknowledgement.
Okay. You have to put, okay. We acknowledge that the land we are meeting on today is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bout Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations, peaceably shared and cared for the land and resources around the Great Lakes, and also recognizes and supports the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Calls of Action. We give thanks to the Indigenous people of these territories who have resisted colonial violence for centuries in serving as stewards and protectors of the land. Today, we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, share, and learn together on this land. Thank you. And also, herein, we also acknowledge the realities, resistance of the displaced Indigenous peoples of the African continent, who through the enslavement and subjugation to colonial violence were forced and coerced into migration and replanted on these lands. We give thanks where we are still here. We also give a special note. For many of us are feeling emotionally and mentally exhausted during this time of collective global trauma resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, including racial injustice, domestic violence, and terrorism, hate crimes, economic disparities, climate catastrophes, and more. Please be aware of many triggers as you participate in these sessions. Make sure to take breaks or step away when you need to. Thank you.
We'd also like to take a moment to invite a moment of silence at this time as we recognize that today is a day acknowledging the missing and the many missing and murdered women across the country of Canada whose families are still seeking for answers to their whereabouts, as well as acknowledgement that September 30th was the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. So we invite a moment of silence before we continue. Thank you. So before we continue on, we'd like to take a moment just to introduce ourselves as hosts of this ongoing webinar series, Is History Repeating Itself? So I'd like to pass it over to Paida and Chantel, who are our coordinators from Weston Mount Dennis.
Hi. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your Monday evening with us. You could be anywhere, but you chose to spend it with us. And so for that, we are so grateful. My name is Paida. I'm a mom and a wife, and I currently live in Mount Dennis. I'm the community engagement worker. And alongside Chantel, we are working to protect mainly Weston and Mount Dennis residents, letting them know about community benefits, letting them know that the framework is real, and this is a time to get involved because the community is changing and it's changing quickly.
Thanks, Paida. My name's Chantel. I am the OSN coordinator for Weston and Mount Dennis. Just quickly, just off of what Paida said, yes, we are mainly focused on resident engagement and developing a vision for the community in which we can see both of our communities thrive. So I'm really, really happy to have joined forces with our other OSN team and happy to be in this space with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chantel and Paida. Good evening, everyone. And I have to echo Paida's sentiments. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Kadeen Bankasing, and I am a resident of the Lawrence Heights and Neptune community. I should say Neptune and Lawrence Heights community, and also a member of the community development team at North York Community House. And it has become a very dear and almost passion, intense obsession of mine to engage with residents across the city of Toronto in conversations around redevelopment and the changing kind of landscape of our communities, as well as the opportunity to really build our knowledge around what these processes mean for us as residents of the city and how we will be impacted by them. Thank you very much. On to you, Shannon.
So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Shannon. I am the Our Strong Neighborhood Coordinator for Lawrence Heights. And in my role, I really support residents, development opportunities and resident-led initiatives and help advocate for community spaces, economic development and community economic development, as well as support resident capacity building, as well as leadership opportunities as well too. And as we all mentioned in our introductions, together we are a team working on the Our Strong Neighborhoods projects in Lawrence Heights, Neptune, Weston and Mount Dennis, Lotterton, throughout North York. And these projects really aim at supporting community engagement and action around redevelopment. Next slide. So what I really mean by redevelopment in its simplest terms is that when an area is rebuilt, the intention or the intent of improving livelihoods in various aspects of an area or community. So Toronto and Canada on the whole are no strangers to redevelopment. I mean, we all know those construction seasons, right? So some people thrive from redevelopment, while many residents, especially in Black and other marginalized communities, are negatively impacted and excluded from decision-making processes surrounding redevelopment. Next slide. So when I say communities, I mean people who come together or within a space that have common interests, values, goals, characteristics, and so on. Next. So for this session and throughout our whole webinar series, the big question we ask is, looking at the past experiences of Black communities in Canada, are we seeing these impacts, processes, exclusions happening again and again? So now I'll pass it on to my colleague Pida, who will talk a bit more about our webinar series.
Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. Yeah, so we'll just go over why we're here. So we hope to really inspire people with shared knowledge, define key concepts, and create connections between anti-Black racism and urban development in Canada. And also, this is an opportunity to encourage residents to participate and share their digital and multimedia stories. And with all that being said, we want to explore this, and we know that Toronto has a lot of diversity, but really our big goal here is to explore this through an anti-Black racism lens. And so before we get into that, let's sort of unpack that definition. So by anti-Black racism, we are calling into the City of Toronto definition, and anti-Black racism is policies and practices that are embedded in Canadian institutions that reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and or discrimination that are directed at people of African descent and are rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization here in Canada. And so anti-Black racism can be seen in a couple different ways. It could be micro in the everydayness, and then of course it could be structural. And I believe if you go to the next slide, there is another definition that goes into that. Yeah, so the legacy of anti-Black racism, if you look at this definition here, it covers everything from employment rates, unemployment, poverty, mental health, child welfare. But what we usually don't see reflected in these definitions is just sort of how redevelopment and displacement can really take an impact on Black communities, as Shannon was saying earlier. And so I know we've heard of this word so many times, especially in the community I live in Mount Dennis, that revitalization is happening and it's coming. And while it all sounds really good in terms of, you know, just like the glitz and the glamour of condos and new commercial buildings coming up, it really does impact, as Shannon mentioned, a lot of Black communities. I mean, I don't know if anyone has been to Little Jamaica recently, but to be honest, it's very desolate and it's not as I remember it. It's pretty empty. I just the other day went to a beauty shop and a woman was saying that she's lucky. She's lucky if she makes a sale that day. And it's not as I remember it as a child. It used to be very vibrant, but because the LRT is coming all across Eglinton, we see those changes happening. And of course, in Regent Park, that's a great example of how revitalization really impacted the neighborhood and displaced so many, especially it was predominantly a Black neighborhood before 2005. But since then, it's really changed and changed the social landscape. And so many of those people have been now displaced to Downsview area. And yeah, speaking about Regent Park as well, that revitalization is there. They have the aquatic center. They even have, they have Daniel Spectrum. They just have so much going for the community. And I remember 10 years ago, it was sort of a food desert there. You couldn't find a grocery store within a few kilometers, but now they have a major grocery store, they have food markets, I think almost every other day. And of course, that oven wood fire pizza, I think they have events surrounded by that. But we have to really think about who is this for? Because yeah, the market has changed and obviously new people have moved in and really have gentrified the neighborhood. And so we are talking about Weston and Mount Dennis right now, especially as they go under this redevelopment, and we have to really prioritize these vulnerable voices that often aren't heard, and these kind of discussions are really important.
Thank you, Prida. I'm going to move forward. So one of the things that we want to do over the coming sessions that'll take place between October and November is to really highlight some of these communities, right? Some of these current communities that are experiencing and undergoing, whether it be revitalization or redevelopment, as well as to explore the histories of Black communities in Canada, right? Something that we rarely are definitely not exposed to in school, right? And rarely are having the conversations that help us to build our awareness. And so in this conversation, we really want to acknowledge that there is a legacy of Black communities across Canada that can be traced to migrations out of the Underground Railroad and beyond. And that is just one way that Blacks have come to Canada. There have been countless ways. And then we also want to really acknowledge that there are many communities currently under redevelopment in Toronto that have, you know, close connections to the legacy of the immigration policies over the last 60 years. And while these communities now are not Black, they have been populated by predominantly or considered or referred to as predominantly Black communities in the city of Toronto. And again, because of the these changing policies that enable migrations of many people to Canada and to the city of Toronto, many of those communities are probably now more predominantly racialized. So we recognize that there is this nuance to how we're going to tell this story over these sessions, but really, as mentioned before, are using the lens of anti-Black racism to highlight these experiences, but as well to highlight and profile our communities and the way that, that Black people in the city of Toronto and in Canada have been impacted by redevelopment. Part of what we will also do during this time is profile one of our communities, each, let's say, each session. And so we're going to start with a very quick introduction to Lawrence Heights. And this is not in any way to take away from the wonderful presentation that Denise, Bishop-Earle will guide us through later on, but really just to give a highlight, an overview of this community. And we will try to do this with a number of communities over the session as well. So I really just wanted to quickly, and probably take only a couple minutes, to share with you a little bit about Lawrence Heights. So Lawrence Heights is a social housing community, located almost in the center of Toronto. We are just west of Yonge, just south of the 401, and fronted by Dufferin on the west side, Bathurst on the east, and Lawrence Avenue West on the south. The community itself is, whoops, now it won't change, of course. The community itself is very much recognizable by this kind of very circular, oh, what a life. The circular shape or kind of built form that really has very much kept the community in the center of the city very enclosed, if you will. And it's very noticeable in any of its aerial pics because this entire circle here is Lawrence Heights and everything within it. And you'll also notice that the Lawrence Allen Expressway runs through the middle of it. The community itself was formerly located on farmland that was owned by the Mulholland family. And the area itself, this farmland itself was had begun to transform from farmland into subdevelopments in the 1930s. Lawrence Heights itself, however, was built over a period of almost 8 years between the mid-1950s and was concluded in 1962 and provided an opportunity for affordable housing affordable housing for many of the veterans who had fought in World War II. And was also a part of Canada's some Canadian policies that were meant to create affordable home opportunities, rental and otherwise, for Canadians during this time. The community itself, of course, was built in the kind of structure of what at the time was referred to Garden City. So it meant homes surrounded by a great deal of green space that was meant to create environments and communities to promote healthy living and well-being for the families that live there. And what we experienced over the next 50 years was a complete disrepair of the community itself. Many of the homes have run into and have needed to experience a great deal of repairs. Of course, it's just time and the natural, if you will, the natural shelf life of any home. Revitalization now that we are experiencing in this community was introduced in 2008, but was meant to be a process by which these homes fallen too far into disrepair that they could be replaced through a process of demolition and then rebuilding. And in fact, the financial process to be able to do that is to build market homes, right? And to sell market homes that would then raise capital to replace the social housing in these communities. So these plans that are scrolling across the screen right now in this area, in fact, site plan, phase 1 is the first quarter of the revitalization of Lawrence Heights. And what we can see here is what the community will look like in the future. And I just want to say that, in fact, where we are right now currently is that this entire area here, known as the phase 1, has been demolished. So anything that was remaining or that existed of the Lawrence Heights that many of the residents will have known it as is no longer there. And what we are working towards is creating a plan that will look, or the community, at least this phase 1 area, that will look like this and should be completed in the next, let's say, 4 to 5 years. Stop there. So now we have one last piece of interaction or a piece of knowledge to share with you before our wonderful guest speakers take the stage. So I am going to quickly share with you a video, and it's a quick 2-minute video about a historically Black community in Canada.
You see degeneration in the north end of Halifax, in the Negro slum called Africaville, whose 500 souls with their privies and wells cling to a rocky, sewerless hillside overlooking Bedford Basin.
If things are this bad, why don't you move? I know this is your...
Where?
Well, where would you go?
Move to go where?
Services end 100 yards from Africaville. The Negro here has no garbage pickup, no running water, no sewage service, no paved roads, no public transportation. He pays taxes. But there is a pride here. It's a place where you can lick and soothe your wounds. The Negroes have been told that they must...
These $60 Japanese smart patches are taking the world by storm.
Just apply them before bed.
Must leave by 1967 when the bulldozers come in.
I've been here so long, you know, it doesn't make any difference to me. But it's the young people, they got their life to live. But still, I love my home.
It was shipped out on the back of the city dump trucks.
It's come to be known as Seaview Park. This is where the settlement of Africaville once stood. Each summer, the Africaville Genealogical Society holds a reunion.
I had an inherent ownership of that land.
This is a bittersweet day.
Today, the Minister of Canadian Heritage tried to right the wrong many Black Nova Scotians feel by designating this park a federal heritage site, meaning it's protected from development.
And as the fabric has been torn apart, so the fabric can be mended.
Still, some say a plaque can't make up for the destruction of an entire community.
We don't want a plaque. We want our compensation package. We want our home for our home. We want our royalties.
Last year, an official apology was given on behalf of the city of Halifax. With that, the name Africaville was restored and $3 million in compensation given to rebuild the church.
Well, the reconstruction of the church is part of the way back towards saying that Africaville was not a mistake. Africaville was a wonderful community.
Great, and we'd just like to take a moment to invite a quick poll following that brief clip about the community of Africaville. I would just like to invite you here to answer the questions, but really just to as well share, are you aware of Africaville or other historically Black communities in Canada? And how are you being impacted, or are you being impacted by redevelopment in your community? So you will have to respond to all three questions. We're also wondering if you are a resident of any of the communities listed on the screen. Respond to all three questions and submit, and then we can share. Chantal, I think you can
so
take it anytime. Yeah.
It's been up for a minute. I'm going to give it about 45 more seconds. As you see, not everyone has had an opportunity to answer. So it's going to be up for another 30 seconds. If you feel comfortable, feel free. I'm going to wrap up the poll now. And should we share results? Yeah. So we have some participants from Jane and Finch, as well as other neighborhoods. And it seems like majority of participants are aware of Africaville, which I think I can speak for the whole panel, the whole panelists, that's puts a smile on our face. It's unfortunate that many of you guys have been impacted by relocation and population changes. So these are a few points that we're going to discuss during today's webinar. So stay with us. We'll cover all of these points. Thank you. Can I stop sharing? Is that okay? For those of you who may not have felt comfortable filling out the poll, feel free to discuss amongst one another in the chat if you feel comfortable with that. Or if you have any questions that are specific to your own situations or your neighborhoods, direct them to the Q&A and we will have our panelists answer them at the end. I guess without further ado, we will move forward. So I want to invite our first panelist to the virtual stage. Evelyn Amponsah is currently the director of the Center for Advancing the Interests of Black People, a new division established by TCHC, which is Toronto Community, I forgot, TCHC, Toronto Community, what's TCHC? I totally forgot, I'm so sorry guys, it's been a long day.
Toronto Community Housing.
Yes, thank you.
You're
to lead
welcome.
Confronting Anti-Black Racism Strategy. Evelyn is also a PhD candidate at York University. Her research is on the impacts of anti-Black racism on both Black and non-Black people. She has over 10 years experience working in the community sector, working as a program director, managing youth, seniors, and community development programs for Black and racialized youth. She's also recognized for her ability to work from a grassroots, asset-based, community-centered approach. Evelyn is an educator who utilizes her social service work experience, education, and passion for social issues to teach about diversity, social problems, and community development from an anti-oppressive, anti-racist, trauma-informed praxis. Evelyn has a wealth of experience training senior leadership, frontline staff, and making support teams to develop a competency in applying a confronting anti-Black racism lens. So without further ado, we would love to welcome Evelyn Amponsah to the virtual stage.
Thanks, Chantal. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Just want to start off by thanking you all for having me. I think this is such an important conversation, and I feel very honored to have been asked to not only join the conversation, but to kick off the series, which sounds like a really important, impactful series, and I'm happy to be a part of creating that impact within the communities that we live and work in. So I'm gonna ask Kadeen to start sharing my presentation, just mainly images that I've put together. What I want to start off in terms of responding to the question, which is, is history repeating itself in terms of the ways in which Black communities in Canada are evolving, I would say. Is this something that we've seen before? And for me, it's really interesting, this question around, have we seen it before? Because of the ways in which Black communities get erased. So it's hard for many of us to kind of track the repeating of these kinds of histories because of the way that they're erased from the national conversation, and they're just erased from our histories, and we don't necessarily have access to this information. I think it was Katie who mentioned that growing up, we don't learn about these histories in schools, we don't learn about these communities, and so when things happen to Black communities, sometimes they feel familiar, but we can't necessarily put our finger on it, right? Because we don't necessarily have all of that information that connects us to how exactly it has happened in the past. And so I wanted to kind of just start off there, and I want to also talk about, I've titled my presentation, "What Does It Mean to Be Disposable?" And the reason why I titled it that is because to the point of the presenters, we're looking at things through an anti-Black racism lens. And the definition of anti-Black racism, which really talks about the experience of slavery and colonization. I often like to tell people that experience of slavery, that system that was meant to dehumanize Black people, came along with ideas that allowed for the dehumanization of Black people, ideas that allowed for Black people to be used as slaves. Not only that, but ideas that allowed for Black people's bodies to be disposable. And so it's really important for us to kind of bring that history, that understanding of anti-Black racism to this conversation because of the way is in which it helps us to understand what happened, why does this continue to happen to Black communities in the ways that it happens to Black communities. So if we're able to kind of really make that connection to this history of slavery, where Black families were seen as disposable, Black homes were seen as disposable, Black people weren't even connected to home, right? The idea was you could be picked up and put into another plantation. You could be picked up from Africa, for example, and taken to the New World, and that wouldn't have any impact on your psyche or your body because as an individual, you are disposable, right? And so all of these ideas also show up in the ways in which Black communities in Canada are disposed of, and Black communities that have long roots and long histories are treated within Canada. So just wanted to start there with a few of those comments, those thoughts. And I'm going to be going through a few different communities that I think are of note. And what I want participants to do is kind of see the patterns in terms of what's going on with these communities, with these spaces. Think about, and then I invite you to think about what's happening today. I invite you to think about, I'm going to speak mainly to the West End because that's what I'm familiar with. But if we think about Grove, if we think about Lawrence Heights, if we think about Falstaff, if we think about Chalk Farm, if we think about all of these spaces in which it's a predominantly Black population, predominantly Black and racialized, I want us to think about, even if these processes are not currently happening now to these spaces, what are the ways in which these spaces are constructed? How do we understand these spaces that will allow in the future for them to go through the same process that Lawrence Heights is currently going through right now, that Regent Park went through recently? Because the construction of these spaces are all the same, right? So even if it's not happening, the redevelopment is not happening right now, it's right around the corner, right? Like it's imminent because they're constructed in the same ways that allow for them to then face the same kind of destruction and revitalization, et cetera. So with that being said, I'm gonna go on, Keaton, can you go on to the first slide? So this is a picture of Africaville. I'm gonna give, I know folks said that they have, they've heard of Africaville, but I'm gonna give some history around Africaville and some other insights that I think are important for the conversation. So as folks know, Africaville is a Black community in Halifax. It was bulldozed by the city during the 1960s. And it was a small settlement established by former American slaves. Africaville was founded by Black loyalists, Maroons, and their descendants who migrated to Nova Scotia after the War of 1812. What's really important about the War of 1812 is this was the war for independence. So the crown, the British crown, and the Americans, this was that war. And Black people who were enslaved in the US were invited to fight on behalf of the crown, and they would have received their freedom if they did do that. Not only would they receive their freedom, but they would also receive land. And so the settlement, Africaville, was the land that was given to Black people who fought on behalf of the crown during the War of 1812. That's important for a lot of reasons for us to consider the ways in which Black people are invited into Canada or invited into the nation state for a purpose, for a use, and then can be discarded once that purpose or that use has been attained, right? When we're thinking about this question around disposability, because historically, we have lots of examples of that. If you look at the Caribbean domestic worker scheme that invited in Black women to be nannies and caregivers, because there was a particular use for the black woman at that time. And then over time, right, we see that there's no use for Black women anymore. And then what happens to they're treated. So really important to understand how Black people end up in Canada and how the ideas around how we end up here then allow us, that use is over, and so people then become disposable. And sorry, can you folks just keep me on time? Because I can tend to go on and on. So just maybe the hosts, when I get about, when I have a couple minutes left, just let me know. So really important, again, is how were Africvillians, and I like to actually use the term exiled from Africville. I think exile is a good lens to understand what happened to the people in Africville, because they were essentially exiled from that land, right? Even though it's within Canada, they were the government was like, you have to go and you cannot come back, right? Like you cannot return. And that is a form of exile. And it's really important for us to, and I like to use that language, but what happened, right? Like what was the history behind it? And again, we can replace Africville with a lot of the examples that we see today in our communities that are close by us. One of the earliest ways in which the government started to interrupt the development of Africville was with a railway, right, going through the city. So what does that remind us of, right? Eglinton. What does it remind us of? It reminds us of, I think Kadeen showed that Google view of Lawrence Heights. You have the highway going right through the community, right? Lots of different examples of how cities, through city planning, start to interrupt the development of communities, right? And we also know what transportation through a community means. It means that more people have easier access to that community, which means you start to encourage other kinds of migration and population growth, right? People coming from outside moving into those spaces. So that was the first way in which Africville, the government started to interrupt the development of Africville. Subsequent to that, there was a nearby prison that was constructed, an infectious disease hospital, and a nearby dump. So intentionally, right, the city of Halifax starts putting in all of these undesirable spaces around Africville. They also deny Africville access to clean water, access to different kinds of development that's necessary for a city to grow and for people to be healthy within that space. And as I was just doing some of the research and thinking about this over again, it just reminded me, like, and I think it was Paida who mentioned, like, just going to Eglinton West recently, right? We're seeing a higher rate of folks that are homeless in Little Jamaica, folks who are struggling with substance issues within the area. And that just reminded me directly of this, right? When there's an increase in, like, and I'm going to use undesirable behavior for lack of a better word, right? Just for lack of a better word. So you start seeing, more of these kinds of things happening in these communities. It's very similar to what happened in Africville. And the justification now for why the government of the city of Halifax then decides that Africville is no longer inhabitable is because they're like, well, look how torn down and run down your community is. Look at the fact that you have this dumpster, it smells, there's this noise pollution, there's this, all of this and they start using the same things that they put into place to now justify the fact that Africville is people cannot live here. Katie, can you go on to the next slide? So Africville is right on the water. That's a really important part of the conversation. And it's why I wanted to show this slide. Because as we know, right, if, just living in Toronto, that anything on the lakeshore is prime real estate. And it's important because that's similar to what happens to Africville. When the land becomes more, in a capitalist system, the land becomes more valuable than the people. And so the people get pushed out so the city can take over this land and do with it as it pleases. Any land that's on the water in most places is more valuable. And so that's also really important because after denying Africvillians that clean water, and after constructing the space and saying, well, nobody can live here, then all of a sudden, all of this development starts in the area, right? Like it becomes a park. All of these things start happening. You're like, wait, so why weren't we able to do this when Africaville existed here? Or why does this happen after the fact? And the answer is obvious. And again, I think if we look at some of the ways in which redevelopment, revitalization is happening within the city, it's very similar, right? It's not until these ideas around how valuable these lands are that we start seeing more and more investment from the city into the communities. The same thing that communities have been asking for forever, now they start being a part of the conversation. Can you go on to the next slide? And this is just a picture of the dumpster that was actually around, that was put around Africaville. I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a visual. Just can go on to the next slide. So now I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about Buxton. Buxton, Ontario is actually really important in terms of Canadian, Black Canadian history and Canadian history generally, for a lot of reasons, and mainly because it was a safe haven. It was a community built by folks that ex-slaves from the U.S. And it was an interesting space. It was one of the first sort of like Black settlements in Canada, and it was one of the destinations of the Underground Railroad. And so the reason why I find this actually so interesting is because we learn about the Underground Railroad in elementary school, right? Most of us who went to school here probably learned about the Underground Railroad, but we never learned about where it led, right? We always learned that there was some North Star somewhere that people followed to Canada, but it didn't tell us where they followed it to. Like, where did they end up? Where did those people end up? So we just have people, in our imaginations, it's just people following this star. They end up in Canada somewhere. We have no idea where these people went. And that's so important, right? That's not part of this narrative about the Underground Railroad. So it's kind of like, people came here, but then they just, I don't know what they did when they came here. We're never told that second part. And Buxton actually is part of that second part of the story in terms of that Underground Railroad. Where did Black people end up? And so, yeah, it was actually, the vision was to establish an entirely self-sufficient and prosperous Black community, and academic and spiritual and all of these different aspects of what it meant to contribute to this space was an important part of the conversation. But it was also a very complicated space, particularly because when there was in the States, they started to try to bring back runaway slaves, right? So there was a campaign for slave catchers, I think they were called, to go and find people who had settled right in Buxton, and people knew of this settlement. So it became a very precarious place to live. Folks were very scared to be there because there were slave catchers who would come in from the US and try to kidnap people and bring them back into slavery. And this bell that you see here was given to the people of Buxton as a way to continue to encourage them to fight for their freedom. And on the bell it's inscribed, "And when the bell with its solemn tones calls you to the house of God, remember your brethren who are in bonds, and let your prayer ascend to God, that he may in his own good time break every yoke and let the oppressed go free." And that's important because a lot of people, there was part of the narrative was that people were just leaving because they were afraid, but there were people who stayed and people who fought. And that's really important to the conversation, because as we think about our spaces, there are people who stay and there are people who fight, right? There are people who are holding on to Little Jamaica to Lawrence Heights. There are people who are there to remind, the rest of us that, this is our home and you can't just dispose of us. And there are symbols of that everywhere, right? Like if you can call Lawrence Square Mall the new Lawrence Heights as much as you want, but we still know it's jungle. We still know it's Lawrence Heights, and it's important for those kinds of reminders to stay within the spaces. Okay, I've just been told I have a few minutes left. I'm gonna keep it moving, keep it pushing. So I want to talk about the British Methodist Episcopal Church, which was downtown on Chestnut Street. Sorry, Katie, can you go, I think, about 2 or 3 slides? Next one. Okay, perfect. So this was this church was originally erected in 1845 and was a political and communal hub for Toronto's Black community during the mid-1800s. It was a very strong hold for the abolitionist movement. The church provided a safe haven for a large influx of freedom seekers arriving in Toronto via the Underground Railroad. Again, so this is another example of where the Underground Railroad actually took people. And so this church, just downtown, right? Like we can go there and see the site where this church was built. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but this church was really freedom and revolution and abolition in Toronto specifically. Was burnt down. It burnt down due to an act of arson. Funny enough, the city, if you go on to the next slide, not the next one, let's see. Yes. So the city now was deciding to put up what is this? A courthouse actually on that land. This is just a few years ago. So these are the impressions of what would go to replace that land. But once they started doing some excavating, they discovered the church, that the church was there. I have a really close friend. Her name is Anik Jordan. She's an artist. She actually was doing some work with the AGO at this time. And she wanted to go and kind of like memorialize the site and whatnot. So initially she spoke to the city planners and they were like, yeah, come through for sure, you can do this. But then when they realized that the project she was really trying to do was connect the destruction of this church and the history of this church to a kind of social political argument about what happens to Black people in Canada, they started denying her access to this space, right? So I wanted to show it as an example of what even happens to us when we want to actually hold these spaces within our memory and make them permanent spaces of reminder of what it means to be Black in Canada, and how the city is very intentional about not allowing these kinds of things to happen. Katie, can you go to the next slide? I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna talk about Eglinton West and Lawrence Heights really quickly, because I just wanna now sort of bring things together. I think Paida did a great job of just describing the energy of Eglinton West back in the day. I'm gonna say back in the day, even though it wasn't that long ago, right? But it feels that long ago because of how long this LRT process is taking, right? It feels like Eglinton hasn't looked like Eglinton for 50 years, right? But really this has not been that long of a process. But the intentional delay, which I like to call white delay, right? White people like to delay things over and over again until we kind of forget about it, right? Or we get tired and we give up. But this Eglinton was Eglinton, just 10, 15 years ago. But what has happened with the LRT, again, this example of a transportation route causing this kind of delay, causing this kind of destruction within a space. And further to that, the ways in which the lack of investment now into the community is causing for it to deteriorate very quickly. Right? Because now there's construction going on, there's no need for this kind of investment. And so the space is deteriorating, and how that kind of narrative is what's going to be used to continue to push Black people out Eglinton. And even though it's been determined to be a heritage site, so Africaville was years later, right? And so that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean the people there get to keep that space. Sometimes it becomes lip service in terms of the government trying to appease the people who are connected to these spaces. And I'm going to move on quickly because I know I'm running out of time. I can go to the next one. And I want to talk about Lawrence Heights. And I really want to talk about Lawrence Heights in connection to the name jungle. Jungle jungle, unfortunately, that name started off to reference Kadine's presentation, was just actually speaking to the way in which the space was enclosed, and wasn't about violence, wasn't about struggle. It was about the way in which the space was kind of enclosed and cut off from like the rest of the area, right? So like a jungle, like you're entering a jungle, which is kind of like a closed off space. But intentionally, the ways in which jungle has been historically, and intentionally connected to ideas around violence, around destruction, around disposability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When in its initial visualization, it was about nature, it was about healthy community, it was about healthy families. And even now with redevelopment and these questions around what does it mean to have healthy communities, there's a way in which that's even being offered to the new residents who are moving into these communities and intentionally being denied from the folks that used to live there, right? So what does that mean? When we look at where the condos are being put up closer to access to transportation, more lit areas, et cetera, whereas it's still intentionally being set up to cut off those who are part of jungle, right? And now it's the new Lawrence Heights. And you don't need fences or anything to kind of determine these things. Like it's very clear what's happening within the community. And again, just thinking about that repetition, that pattern in terms of how it connects to our histories, the histories of other Black communities. So I really want us to think about the formula, right? What is the formula that is used, right? What plus what equals, let's get rid of Black people, right? So it's erasure, right? Plus, destruction, plus, you can go on to that next slide, but it's all of these things, right? There's a formula that is used that we see happen, not just in Toronto, but we see it happen all over Canada. There's a particular kind of formula that the government, once these three things happen, we know what's the next thing, what's the outcome, right? So I think a question for us to take seriously as we go through the series is, how do we interrupt that formula? What is it that we can do as folks that live in this community who can resist and intervene, similar to the ways in which people in the past did, our ancestors did? What does it look like for us to interrupt this kind of formula? And so that we can, we can end up with a different outcome. So I had a slide for questions, but I think we're going to take questions at the end. So I'll just conclude there, and I will pass it back to the hosts to take us to the next part of this conversation. Thank you.
And some most gracious thanks to you, Evelyn, for a fantastic presentation. Short, almost too short to really explore the depth of the communities and the legacies left there, but so valuable for us to really orient ourselves to, in fact, this idea that, yes, there is a very long relationship of Blacks to the land in Canada. So I think at this point, we wanted to take a quick break as we get prepared to come back and talk with Denise about her lived experiences being in a revitalization community. So actually, I'm seeing 7:03 here. How about we just take like a quick 3-minute interlude, and we'll return back and continue on with the rest of our presentations. Thank you very much.
Cultural groups, and who understood the community history and informal networks. And we were recruited and trained to build bridges among the different communities and with the different organizations and agencies that were impacting community life. And we saw ourselves as agents of change who acted as messengers of the project, stimulating debate, discussions, encouraging tenants to participate in developing solutions to the issues of local importance. And so we started to break down the barriers down for systemic, the systemic barriers down, sorry. Next, please. I can't even see the slide, actually. Is there any way you could move it over? Oh, anyway, it doesn't matter. We started to, okay. Oh no, it doesn't. You're going, have to go back. Back, baby. Keep going. You went too far. Okay, it doesn't matter. So we started to build a plan together in 2017, and that included Toronto Community Housing, the City of Toronto, Toronto District Heights Development, Lawrence Heights Interorganizational Network, and a lot of the other agencies and organizations that fed into Lawrence Heights, and plus the animators. We worked together to inform the community. And we used various forums, focus groups, Friday night cafes, workshops, thousands of surveys and questionnaires, newsletters, and as a way to teach the community about what urban development was in terms of how the city and TCH brought it to us. So we were just spreading the word in a sense. Next, please. Next, please. So we have developed grassroots community priorities that reflected the plan, and these were from the community. So these were from the people that lived in the community, and there were 10 of them, and the first one was support a bottom-up process. This next one was zero displacement in relocation plan. And this was important because for many of us, we were concerned that if people were forced out, they would lose their networks. But even more importantly, the young people who lived in the community would end up being in danger because, you know, there was conflict going on amongst the young people. And if they were to move into another community where they had conflict with, then that might put them in harm. So there was environmental health, security during the build, better school and community health programs, integrated mix of housing units, equivalent size and type of units, and you know a lot of them are tiny now, concrete employment objectives, green space, which is very important to me, and diverse home ownership, because in Lawrence Heights, no one owns anything. There's nothing in Lawrence Heights that people that live their own. And so that was another important piece. Next, please. And so we made sure that residents' voices were heard in the development of the revitalization plan. And so there was the Lawrence Allen Revitalization Plan, the Secondary Plan, the Social Development Plan, the Employment Service Plan, the Heritage Plan, Arts and Cultural Hub Feasibility Study, and the Public Arts Plan. So we were part of all that, and we were the ones that actually helped form those pieces. Next, please. And we also helped the revitalization plans get approved and the social development plan get approved by the city. We prepared and presented deputations that were instrumental in making sure that the primary plan was passed in 2010 and the social development plan in 2012. We worked with the city to develop these plans, and they had to let us know that if we didn't work with them, it would have been difficult for them to pass it. And we were also involved, and I actually was involved in choosing the developer partner for Lawrence Heights for the first phase. And apparently it was the first time that they had ever allowed residents to be involved in an RFP. And so we actually learned from these processes. And it helped us later on. As you go on, you'll see that it didn't help us as much as we hoped so. Next, please. We assisted in making sure that the secondary plan was approved. And we helped in making sure residents' needs and concerns were addressed during and after the relocation was made, and they were reflected in the relocation documents. We also were involved in organizing the street naming events for the two sites, and that's 1A and 1B in the revitalization right now. And we had members participating in the Lawrence Heights art exhibits, jury, the resident arts, heritage, and cultural arts group. So these were the things that we were doing. And I just wanted to give you a sense of the things that we were doing before things changed. Next, please. We assisted in the planning and coordinating of community meetings. Next, please. We co-created and participated in training sessions and focus groups. Next, please. We shaped and conducted surveys and questionnaires. So all these things. We collaborated with Toronto Employment and Social Services and Heights Development to help maximize opportunities for success. Next, please. We co-created and co-facilitated community events, and there was lots of events, and that they started with community. And we supported safety initiatives. Next, please. I'm not going to get into them. We assisted in applying for city funding to help build strong communities. Next, please. We did our best to be involved in the process. And I started with this because before I started doing this part, I was reading that Ida Sadu had made a comment about residents need to be involved, and we were involved, but something else happened. Next, please. Then everything changed. In 2017, without notice, we, the animators, were silently let go. No reason offered, not even a thank you for all the things we had contributed to the revitalization. So there was a lack of community inclusion in the revitalization tables. We lost our voice, essentially. Uh-oh, sorry, my dog is barking. This happens when you, due in part to the fact that the program had been, first it was paused and then it was totally abolished. And so this caused a delay in the flow of information to the community. And at some point it actually stopped. So, but a year later, they hired a group of people and they called them community ambassadors. And they were just glorified people who put flyers in our doors. And when I approached them and asked them if they had the ability to challenge what was going on in the revite tables, they said no, they didn't feel comfortable enough actually challenging some of the things that they wanted to speak to. So residents were no longer seen as stakeholders in the process. We were experiencing intimidation when we spoke about concerns, and in the cases when we wanted to take action, and it caused an increase in a sense of isolation, distrust, resulting in residents losing faith in the process. And now the process is becoming very top down. In fact, it's coming so top down that I recently got a newsletter about revitalization, and everything in it didn't even mention the ambassadors. It was just about what agencies and Toronto Community Housing was doing for the youth. There was nothing in there about anybody else. It was pretty much all about youth. And I was a little concerned because youth are only one part of the community. And there was no interaction between or co-creation of anything with community and the Revite management team. So I was like, okay, this is what's happening. And it was unfortunate. Next, please. So current residents who were forced to relocate without adequate supports being given to cushion the social and emotional shock of moving, compounded by having to witness the demolition of their homes and community spaces and networks. So if you see that, if you looked at this picture, if you saw what was there before and what's there now, imagine how you feel. If you've lived in a space for as long as we've had. I've been there for 37 years. And when I look at this picture, it breaks my heart. But there's nothing in place to support people who are going through the grieving process of losing their homes and the space in which they live in. And so the other thing we experience is a lot of our kids are having a hard time getting into their local school, their home school, which is now called John Polani. It used to be called Bathurst Heights. And so, as you said, Evelyn, they take something and they change it, and it becomes something more, they call it the cleansing. The cleansing and making it more palpable for a certain type of people. And residents were becoming susceptible to violence due to the loss of community spaces and their natural pathways. And so a lot of the youth were informing us that they were being chased by suspicious vehicles and people. And we even had a shooting in the square, which, and this is what happened as a result of those spaces being closed down or being blocked, and kids not having a safe spaces to move back and forth, and being exposed out into spaces where they couldn't navigate safely. And so this has led to an increase in the surveillance of police, the installation of hundreds of cameras, as well as the increase of lighting. We have so much lighting, I'm so done with it. I don't know why they're putting so much lighting. It's like, who are they putting it there for? I always ask. Next, please. So access to homes and local spaces is met with layers of red tape, reducing user-friendliness, citing tenants as liabilities. If we want to use space, and I don't know what space we're going to use right now because there is no space, we have to sign a document saying who's going to be there, how many residents, how many non-residents. If there's too many non-residents, then there's a fee that's attached to it. So there's that flow of just going into spaces, you know, naturally is gone. And even in our basements, I got this notice that said that I had too much stuff in my basement. And if I showed you the notice, it was like, my basement is clean. It may have a lot of stuff in it, but it's clean. But it made me sound like I was a hoarder and that I was filthy house. And it was just amazing what they had put on in that letter. And there was apparently a blanket letter that they sent out to a lot of people. And I was like, wait a minute, when did this happen? So, but there is not even a letter sent out saying, oh, we're changing the way, you know, you're allowed to put things in your house. It was just, here's a letter and everybody gets the same letter. And it's like, when did my house look at it? I even, before my mom passed away, I showed her this letter and she laughed. She said, I don't know whose house you're talking about. I said, yeah, I know. But see, these are the kinds of things that they're doing. They're starting to send out these letters. And so when I look at, what is it, tenant refresh? I'm wondering, what are they refreshing in some cases? So tenants who are over under house are being forced out of the community in large numbers. We have been informed that zero displacement does not apply to them, and that the clause that says no current residents would be displaced has been ignored. So, and many of those people who are moved out of the community are people of African descent, because I know the ones who stay here, and I know many of the ones who are staying here, and many of the ones that have been moved out. And most of the ones I see moving out are of African descent. And we were informed that the vacant units that are only provided to people who are being relocated as a result of revitalization. So, and the other thing is our local schools are losing teachers, support staff, enrichment and special education classes, after school programs and school resources due to declining student enrollment, because all those people are being forced out. And a lot of the people who are moving in are not moving in with kids. They're usually couples, single people, you know, I'll call it one parent families or whatever you call it. But so we're not getting those families coming in who are filling up those spaces. And the future of our new community center promised as part of the phase 2 of revitalization is now in question because the provincial government that we have right now has withheld funding or has danced around the whole idea of funding. And Lawrence Square Mall has also been revitalized. It's no longer called Lawrence Square Mall, it's called the Lawrence Island Center. More expensive, more poofy than it was before. I mean, before it had a je ne sais quoi about community, you know, it was our spot where we sat and we talked. And now you can't even sit in those spaces. They encourage you, you know, you sit in a space, well, even before revitalization, they start, you know, telling you to move off. And so the spaces that we used to sit in, all our spaces are disappearing. In fact, if somebody can tell me who lives in Lawrence Heights, if there is a space, please tell me, because I don't know where they are. There just aren't any. So the other thing is the quality of programming and services which reflect residents' needs is on the decline as the community changes to an emerged, revitalized community, and the key community partners continue to transition out of Lawrence Heights. So all those people that were here during the start of revitalization, those people are gone. Those people that were our community heroes, you know, who really were part and really understood what community needs were, they're out and they're bringing new people in. And some of these people don't even know what is going on because they're not really informing them as to what was happening in the past in terms of revitalization. So they're just doing their own thing, and it's really hurting the community. So over the years, as staff changed, some of the initiatives that have come out of the older community consultations, as I was saying, such as the heritage and the social development plan, are kind of falling by the wayside. And so it was community activists in the community like Trudy Ann, Kadeen, and a few other people who are actually started to be those change makers and say, hey, we need to start concentrating on these things because these are important to the community. Next, please. I was like, so I used to know everyone in Lawrence Heights. I really did. I really did. And I love being here. And we were a tight community that took care of each other. We worked together, we celebrated, we shared stories together, and we even grieved together. When things happened, we all grieved together. We were not aware of redlining or, the amendments to the Housing Act, all these things that would eventually dismantle our community under the guise of what you were calling urban renewal, slowly chipping away at a foundation of community, which is connections. Lawrence Heights is starting to become unrecognizable to me. Everything that I was connected to in this community is no longer here. And so I don't know if I really want to come back. So somebody said something about slum clearance. Well, maybe that's what it is, that maybe they saw it as a slum and they needed to, because look, they're starting to change. They changed the square, they changed the school, they're changing the landscape. And who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. Hopefully we will find ways to challenge some of the things that are going on, and we'll be able to save our community or get something out of it. I don't know. Next, please. So this is what I think. Revitalization in Lawrence Heights without the implementation of a strong, equitable, and I don't even know if I like that word anymore, neighborhood strategy, will make current residents susceptible to gentrification, displacement, and increased neighborhood distress, especially for the Black community, which makes up about 40% of its population. And for communities in Toronto, that's a large population, because most of them, they assume that they are Black communities, but a lot of them are, Black population may be about 20%. But Lawrence Heights has always had a high population of people of African descent and origin. So this is my thoughts. Agencies that serve Lawrence Heights need to acknowledge the systems of oppression that exist. It's not always about what you say or do, but how you make people feel. Start with the intention to build trust, improve relationships that build educational, employment, and recreational opportunities that promote health and well-being, and build on the importance of community connections. Address the many signs of rapid gentrification, like the many moms and pop stores leaving the mall, just like in Eglinton, the mom and pop stores are disappearing because they can't afford to stay, or former local hubs that have been lost, spaces that held local events, community needs and programs, and services. So build it, and to build it right, recognize that residents, electronic housing, developer partners, the city, Parks and Rec, and the school boards must all work together to create a design that is proven to increase safety and reduce community violence. And lastly, health and community development funders need to invest in community-focused solutions. So that's my ideal. I feel that there's probably a lot more. There's a younger generation that has an eye on things. This is coming from an old hat. And so thank you very much. And I guess it's now question and answer time.
Thank you, Denise, also affectionately known as Mama Denise, for taking us through that timeline. Again, not enough time to really explore the depths of how community was involved and really enable this revitalization project to move forward, especially when a surrounding community was so opposed.
I know.
Developing.
We should have listened to them. But Kadeen, we probably couldn't have controlled anything anyway, because that's the only reason why I became an animator, because I knew that if I didn't, they would have done whatever they wanted to. And my hope was to get as much of community voice in the process of the revitalization as possible. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you very much. There is a few moments for question and answer, and I recognize that our audience is small today. We've done everything on a very tight timeline. I am very appreciative of both Evelyn and Denise for honoring and working with this tight timeline to make this launch happen. We'd like to open the space for any questions, if anyone would like to ask. If you would like to, rather than typing it in the chat, if you raise your hand, we can unmute and you can actually raise your question directly to the presenters. also acknowledge the time. And if there aren't any questions, because we are at 7:30 now, we'd also
Wait.
like to
Wow.
let you know that the session has been recorded and will be made available for viewing and sharing in the coming, let's say at least the coming days and week. And we will look at other ways to make that accessible to everyone. We'll also have our second follow-up session where we will really answer the question, what is gentrification, on Monday, October the 25th at 6 p.m., same time, same Zoom space. And we also encourage you to please share and invite others who might see this conversation and this webinar series as an opportunity for learning. It's one of our shared goals. Like, we're not here necessarily to change anything at this time, but we are sharing knowledge. We are connecting our communities that are undergoing redevelopment, and we are connecting our resident leaders. We want to create space for them to share their stories, as well as to provide opportunities for our knowledge keepers to come and share what oftentimes is not made available to us in a really accessible way. So if there aren't any questions, I haven't seen any hands come up. I would like to say thank you very much for your time this evening and for spending at least part of your dinner hour with us. We look forward to seeing you all again on October 25th. And I'd like one more time to say and offer much gratitude and thanks to Evelyn Amponsah and Denise Bishop-Earle for sharing their knowledge with us this evening.